All right, it looks like we're recording, so I'll just officially welcome you to the podcast, and then we'll get started.
Thanks.
Doug Wilson, welcome to the Think podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me, and this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while, and I'm very, very excited that I get to have it with you now, and that is the subject of classical education. And so, what I'd like to do is sort of lay out a definition of what classical education is. And then my goal is I'd like for Christian parents and maybe soon to be Christian parents or someday Christian parents to walk away with something to think about and maybe even a slight nudge in the direction of pursuing a classical education for their children and maybe even for themselves.
Okay.
So you've written and spoken on a number of subjects, dozens, maybe hundreds, but one of the ones that you've been speaking about for years has been this subject of classical education. How did you get into classical ed?
I got into it via a roundabout way. When my wife and I got married in 1975, a few years later, we had our oldest daughter, Becca. She was a toddler, and we started obviously thinking about how are we going to educate her. And my wife, Nancy, one day said to me, Doug, I can't see handing her over to someone we don't know, saying, here she is, teach her about God and life and everything. And I didn't know anything about Christian ed at the time, but I knew I agreed with that. And so I said somewhat rashly, don't worry, honey, we'll have a Christian school started by the time Becca hits kindergarten. So that was like 2 or 3 years out. And we were in a small town. There was one Catholic elementary school, and then a very teeny tiny Seventh-day Adventist school, and then public schools, and that was it. And so I had just gotten out of the Navy a few years before, and I'd subscribed to Buckley's National Review when I was in high school, and I got it through the Navy, and they would periodically reprint Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. And I remember having read that article back when I was in the Navy. And so I was talking to some people who were on the steering committee with me, and I recalled that article, and I thought, well, I'll go to the library at the University of Idaho and look it up. So we looked up the article, made copies, circulated it. And since we didn't know what we were doing, we thought, well, shoot, we might as well try this, and so we did, and I'm not sure the exact order of this now, but we came up with the motto, a classical and Christ-centered education, and so that classical meant that it wasn't a fundamentalist reactionary academy. Christian, but truncated and very narrow. But Christ-centered meant that it wasn't a private Tony prep school with high tuition that gave you the same basic secularism that you'd get from the government school.
Right.
So we implemented Dorothy Sayers' approach, and to our great delight, it was amazing. So we didn't know everything that we were doing, but we implemented the basic structure and approach, and the results were astounding. And so the first year we just had 19 students, and the second year 50, and the third year 90, and so it took off rapidly. Once we cleared the first year and people knew that we were going to survive, they came on board, and then after a few years, we were able to point to the scoreboard. We were able to say, look at these results. But when we first adopted it, it was all blue sky.